Let's pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, you might have heard of the Bible being one story. Let me tell you the story tonight. It's the story of work. So in the next 20 minutes, we're going to breeze through the whole Bible, and we're also going to take a few stops along the way to look at work for us today. It's a very ancient story, but it's our story as we continue living in it today. So, in the beginning, the earth is formless. It hasn't taken shape yet, but the Spirit of God, it says, is hovering over the waters. And from there, the Spirit goes to work and begins to shape things. And as the Maker begins to shape things, the Maker makes humanity to join in with his work, and God makes humanity in his image. So where other ancient societies are saying that that the image of God is the God King, the Pharaoh, our story says that the image of God is all of us together, male and female, all of us to represent God and do God's work on God's behalf. And that work is a work of fruitfulness, of bringing life and flourishing and wholeness. It's a work of earth keeping. And that's what our work is for today as well. Work is designed for good because God is a worker. Earth was created as a workplace long before anything went wrong. But what do Adam and Eve do? They question the Maker's goodness and they begin to decide for themselves what good and evil are. So frustration and futility become part of work. Women struggle in labour. Men dominate women. The ground doesn't want to cooperate and it produces thorns and thistles. And we want to acknowledge that if that's your experience of work, that it's hard and frustrating and even futile, our story acknowledges the pain of that. Our story says it's not meant to be that way. We want more for work than that. The Maker wants more for work. But sometimes work is a heavy, heavy load. How do you carry that? How much of that can you take? But even in a fallen world, that's not all there is to work. Because even at this moment of terrible division with Adam and Eve, the Maker keeps working, and the Maker actually makes something for them. The Maker makes clothes for Adam and Eve. Because the Maker doesn't just make new things, the Maker works with what's there. And that's part of our work today as well, what we're called to. When we come to work, we find half-made things, structures that have outlived their purpose, subpar materials, relationships that need renewing. We are called, like the Maker, to make use of what's there and to not just make do with it, but to make good with it. We're not just starting new things or introducing missing things, but we're working with what's there. So, all is not lost. There's a frustration in work, and yet there's still the possibility of newness, of a different direction, that things could be different. But the direction that Adam and Eve take, look where that leads, to Babylon, the Tower of Babel. And so people start to organize against the Maker. They create a new technology, bricks, and they use that to make a name for themselves. They build a ziggurat to show that they can make the gods work for them, maybe. And part of how the Maker makes things is that all people are in his image. All people are workers. All people can generate and build and develop things. The Maker's goodness and generosity is such that it's not just the ones who are following him who can experience that. Humans can build amazing things, whatever their relationship with the Maker. But the question is, whose name are you doing it for? Are you doing it to make your name great? Or are you lifting up another name? But even at the Tower of Babel, the Maker's fruitfulness will not be thwarted. So when people gather to build that tower, the Maker scatters them so that his mission of fruitfulness can be completed. But as the Maker's mission goes on, the mission needs a community. And the Maker reaches out to Abraham and calls him out of the city. And so we find Abraham going off on this long wilderness journey. And the Maker promises to Abraham, I'm going to bless you so that you can bless others. And ultimately, all nations are going to be blessed through you. And here again, we see the purpose of work for us. Work's not for our benefit. We work for the common good, for the good of others. It's for passing on the Maker's goodness. It's being blessed to be a blessing. That's what fruitfulness looks like. And we see this really fulfilled, or beginning to be fulfilled at least, in one of Abraham's descendants, Joseph. Joseph is the golden child, but he's from a broken home. And he's not innocent either. And he ends up being trafficked by his own brothers and going off on his own long wilderness journey. And once he lands in Egypt, he faces terrible adversity. But he works in such a way that it's recognized and more responsibility is given to him. And then he's faced with the greatest challenge yet, a climate crisis. But he responds. He keeps working for the common good. He stores up food so that when the famine hits, there's actually still enough. Blessed to be a blessing. He's working for a foreign power, but he's working in line with the Maker's purposes of fruitfulness. And so the people of Abraham have begun to be a blessing to the nations. Did you know that Joseph is an administrator? He's a civil servant. He's dealing with spreadsheets. He's dealing with accounting apps. And if you're an administrator, I wonder what the Maker has in mind for your work. When those processes, those administrative processes are working well, who is served by that? Who might be blessed by that? The Maker loves a good administrator. But you know, the fruitfulness we've been talking about, sometimes that is just threatening to others. And the people of Joseph in Egypt, in the generations to come, they continue to be fruitful and they're actually resented for it. The people of Joseph are enslaved and exploited, and they're forced to build towers for the God King. The Maker doesn't leave them there. He rescues them from slavery. But that experience of slavery becomes so important to them. As the Maker continues to teach his people, Moses keeps saying, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. You cannot be working like that. You cannot go back to that way of working. And we heard that in our first reading tonight. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Don't be working every day. Don't even let your animals work every day. You have to slow down to stop yourselves falling back into slavery. Sabbath is about stopping. It's about recognizing that the story we're living in is the Maker's story. And this relativizes work for us. It means that work is just a thing. It's not everything. We can't make it everything. So let's not be dominated by work. Work is meant to lead somewhere and not just take over and squeeze other things out. I wonder where you've seen that tendency in your own life. We do recognize as well that that's increasingly difficult today when it's not that we want to work more maybe, but for some of us we find we have to work more in order to make ends meet. That's a really difficult situation to be in. Generations later, another figure like Joseph comes along, Solomon, the greatest of Israel's kings, filled with wisdom, and he's blessing other nations with his wisdom. And it seems like the Maker's people, again, are beginning to do what they're meant to be doing. And yet, Solomon himself gets involved with slavery. Solomon builds God's temple, of course, but he also builds a palace for himself. And the palace is larger and more expensive than God's temple. And he uses a conscripted labor force to do it. Solomon begins building a name for himself. And so at the very point when it seems like the Maker's people might be able to begin blessing others, they're stuck in that slavery mindset again, building towers. You know, I think for us today, sometimes when we get a great project or when business begins to take off, the temptation is to try and squeeze more out of it, to capitalize more, to become more efficient, so that we might begin extracting a bit more profit, drawing in more business. But meanwhile, we're treating others more harshly. We're beginning to exploit people. Don't go back to slavery. Don't recreate hardship for others. And you know, in the time of Solomon, the Maker warned his people, if you go back to that way of thinking, I'm going to put a stop to it. I'm not going to let it go on. And so what we see is that in the generations following Solomon, other nations come in. They break up the kingdom. They lead the people off into exile. And so Israel becomes this geopolitical small fry, and the other nations, idolatrous nations, seem to have the upper hand. And there's that the question of the Maker's rule even seems to be up in the air. But does that mean an end to the work of blessing and fruitfulness? Jeremiah the prophet passes on the message to the people in exile. Flourish, put down your roots, grow food, become part of the cities that you're living in. Make a life for yourselves there. Work for the good of the city. Pray for the city. Daniel and his friends are Israelite royals forced to learn the ways of the Babylonians. So they're given new names, and for 3 years they're trained to think and speak like Babylonians. But something interesting happens. Instead of rejecting this, they kind of embrace it while finding clever ways to keep their distinctiveness. So they don't do this grudgingly. They immerse themselves in it, and they're recognized as 10 times better than others. They don't forget the Maker, and they find clever ways to show the Maker's goodness. You know, sometimes for us as Christians in Australia today, we may feel marginalised. We may feel like there's less room for our beliefs and values in the wider community. How do we respond? Well, Jeremiah might say, put down your roots, become part of the wider community, work for the good of the city. Daniel might say, Don't stand outside of culture telling one another what's wrong with it, but live inside it, understand all its ways so that we can actually show the distinctiveness of the Maker and the blessing that he wants for people. In Daniel's time, the prophets continue speaking of a future beyond exile. There will come a time when the captives will be set free, oppression will be lifted, the year of the Lord's favor will come. And those are the words that we heard on the lips of Jesus in our reading. Jesus takes those words up himself, and it becomes clear that he's not just passing on the message, he's actually embodying the message and bringing it about himself. He's coming as deliverer. And his death absorbs the sins of the people and demonstrates the Maker's forgiveness, which is the precondition for true fruitfulness. And in his resurrection to life, Jesus makes new life a present reality. And we see that Jesus is not just bringing something new, he's doing the Maker's ancient work of working with what's there. Picking up the pieces, putting things back on their course. He renews the people of God so that they can get back to plan A, being a light to the world, being a blessing to the nations. Now, there are some followers of Jesus who start to think, everything's on track now. We can kick back. We can just wait till Jesus comes back. We don't have to work anymore. We don't have to do much of anything anymore. But Paul comes making tents. And like we heard in our reading, he comes saying, we're not depending on your hospitality. We're actually supporting ourselves. And we want each of you to be supporting one another and yourselves. And we want you to be working in the Maker's world and doing your work and doing good work so that you can win the respect of outsiders. So make tents like Paul, like Priscilla and Aquila, and make good tents. Be a businesswoman like Lydia and do good business. And that's why Jesus sends his Spirit, so that the people can actually start living in the Maker's ways. So when Jesus does return, he'll be able to find a people who are actually doing what the Maker intended, people whose work is truly life-giving, work that makes room for the widow and the orphan, work that subverts the tower building and the god kings. That's why a crucified Messiah becomes so attractive in the Roman Empire. That's the beauty of Jesus today as well. So the message is not one of just waiting for a final new creation, but the new creation beginning to emerge here and now, where the resurrection life is already beginning to be lived out. So, today, what kind of people will the Maker find? People who are deceived about God's goodness, like Adam and Eve. People who are trying to make a name for themselves, like at Babel. People like Solomon who are working for a good cause but have actually lost the plot and started exploiting things. People like some of those Paul met, spinning their wheels and keeping themselves at arm's length from the world. Or will the Maker find people like Stephen? After Jesus sends his Spirit to empower his people for the resurrection life, the community starts to grow. People from other nations start to join, but the 12 disciples are still just staying in the city, which is strange because Jesus has said that they're going to be his witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Well, as the community grows, the 12 get some other people to start organising food for the widows. And one of those hospitality workers is Stephen, and it says he's filled with the Spirit. Stephen winds up confronting the temple system, just as Jesus had done. He has the chance to tell the true history of the people, and he is killed in the way that Jesus had been. And with his death, Stephen becomes the catalyst for the Maker to scatter his people once again, so that the Maker's mission can continue from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth through a guy from Hospo. You know, sometimes today we think that some kinds of work are maybe more important than others, maybe healthcare, education, Christian ministry. But we see the Maker using the unexpected. And sometimes the Maker's purposes and mission are actually seen more clearly there. Have you ever wondered to yourself, how could the Maker use me in my work? Well, the Maker used Stephen from Hospo. The Maker could use you in your work. I wonder how. And that takes us to the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, which ends with this picture of the city of God coming down to the people of God. And in this picture of how things are finally going to be, work is not done away with, but creation is able to continue in the work that it was made to do. Creator and creation are in sync, collaborating together. The old order has been done away with, and the earth is the workplace that it was always meant to be. Babylon has been transformed. The city now is shining God's light to the nations. The gates are open. The rulers of the earth, it says, are bringing the glory of the nations into the city. There's no need to close the gates against hostile forces, but there can be coming and going and trade taking place in peace. There's no longer any curse. There is healing for nations. And it says the servants of the Lamb will be the earth keepers they were always meant to be. That original picture of fruitfulness can continue. So we're headed to a city that's not fully here yet, but the picture is of a heavenly city coming to earth. So our work today is a place where we can look for those glimpses of new creation, showing who the Maker is, bringing the Maker's life. The story doesn't end there in Revelation. The Maker continues walking with us as we keep living in his story. So we wonder, what's still to come on the way to that final city? What does the Maker have in mind for our work?